on the eve of what may be the most important election in modern American history, which will certainly have its ramifications for the Gulf region. Particularly, we are grateful to our guests from the Hill, diplomats, NGOs, the policymaking communities actually, because we include the Gulf region, and universities, as well as all of our attendees. For the obvious reasons, we had to adjust our platform and disperse our audience across different thematic panels. We will miss our customary 500 plus in-person gathering, but are delighted to welcome to our panels the hundreds of residents from across the globe and from a dozen different time zones. I would like to take a brief moment to recap our activities over the course of the past year. We have seamlessly transitioned from traditional in-person activities and now present numerous timely webinars and interviews that benefit from the inclusion of many more regional participants. A silver lining in the black cloud of the pandemic. We also have published many analyses addressing topics ranging from the changing regional political landscape to social issues affecting everyday people in the Gulf. In addition to our virtual events, we have kept our audience up to date through our various digital platforms, including our newly launched podcast, the Gulf International Forum's Majlis. You can check it out online. We are proud that we are the only think tank in Washington that talk with the Gulf region and not at the Gulf region. We have brought together Washington and Gulf-based experts to share differing and often clashing views. Each of these events demonstrate our commitment to open, reasoned, and objective discussion of difficult subjects. Our upcoming panels and conversations this week will highlight important themes to watch as we approach 2021. The pandemic of 2020 has brought to a head the accumulating security challenges to the Gulf region, what could be a permanent decline in fossil fuel prices, combined with intra-GCC divisions and conflicting signals from Washington that threaten in some way Gulf stability. Doubts that Washington's willingness to maintain its current strategic presence have renewed regional fears and skepticism as we approach the upcoming elections. US partisan politics have distorted US foreign policy, and as I said, we have convened this conference on the eve of the US election, an event that could transform the American relationship with the region. Throughout the week, our various experts will fully address the issue I mentioned to shed light on the political landscape, the current economic context, and the geopolitical trends we see unfolding today. I am certain that many of our panelists will disagree, and as we have consistently emphasized, a healthy discussion demands such disagreement, and our forum welcomes it. Now, to finally start our program, I would like to welcome Professor Dave DeRoche. He's Associate Professor at the National Defense University, a non-resident fellow with Gulf International Forum, a co-author, and a personal friend. He will be moderating our panel, The Changing Dynamics of Gulf Security in 2020. Without further ado, David.
Thank you, Dania. It's an honor to be here today. So the role of the moderator is just to provide an introduction to the speakers and then to take questions. Although at Gulf International Forum, I know that I'm expected also to throw cards. So we have three fantastic speakers here today. I think they're known to everybody who's going on. I'll give brief introductions. And then to let speakers know, we have time cards. Each of the speakers has 5 minutes to speak. I'll give you the 2-minute warning and the stop card when we're doing that. And the purpose of this is not so much to constrain the speakers as it is to give maximum time for the questions, which I urge you to submit via the application here. I will compile them and then ask them of the speakers. And hopefully that'll allow me to maybe aggregate some questions and get them in an efficient manner. So our first speaker today, Dr. Serwa of Johns Hopkins University, is a renowned expert known to all. Dr. Serwa, you've got 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you, David. And first, let me thank the Gulf International Forum, not only for the opportunity to lead off this conference, but also for all its efforts in recent years to add a new dimension to the analysis of Gulf issues in Washington. Dania and Anas, you and your crew have done a great job. Thank you. The Gulf today is engulfed with multiple dimensions of conflict and instability. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are still at odds with Qatar, as well as with Turkey and Iran, about leadership in the region and the role of political Islam in the Muslim world. The US is pursuing a maximum pressure campaign against Iran that has repercussions throughout the Gulf and the Levant, especially in Iran and Iraq. Iran is responding with maximum resistance, which includes continued support for the wars on their own people by Bashar al-Assad and the Houthis, as well as shifting Iranian foreign policy in the direction of Beijing and Moscow. Global warming, declining oil prices, youth bulges, sectarian resentments, and COVID-19 are challenging the ability of Gulf states to maintain their social contract, authoritarian stability and material prosperity in exchange for political quiescence. US priorities in the Gulf have shifted. Oil is far less important economically and politically than it once was. And America's main terrorism threat is domestic, not international. Higher priority in Washington now goes to countering the spread of weapons of mass destruction and limiting the influence of rival powers in the Middle East. The problems for the United States is that none of its interests in the Gulf are well served by coercion, but neither are they well served by withdrawal, which hurts partners and allies, even giving them incentives to develop nuclear weapons while opening new opportunities for rivals. Whoever is elected president next month, the US interest in reducing its commitment to the Gulf will continue, but it needs to be done without endangering friends and encouraging adversaries or unleashing a regional arms race. Biden and Trump should be expected to behave differently in pursuing US goals. President Trump is impatient and transactional. He will likely pull the plug on US troops in places not prepared to protect or pay for them. Iraqis and Syrians know something about that. And the Abrahamic agreements are transactional. Israel gets recognition in exchange for its help in sustaining Gulf autocracies. Biden did not invent this idea, but he isn't opposed to it. Where the candidates differ is on Palestine and on governance in the Arab world. Biden continues to favor a two-state outcome for Israel and Palestine, whereas Trump and his Israeli partners seek to eliminate any possibility of a viable Palestinian state. While safeguarding Israel's security, Biden would push for a better deal for the Palestinians than the one Trump has offered. He would also be less tolerant of Gulf human rights abuses. Biden and Trump also differ on the value of the Iran nuclear deal. But it's important to recognize that they share the same goal: to prevent Tehran from acquiring nuclear weapons. Trump's approach is maximum pressure, mainly through unilateral sanctions, but also including the threat of kinetic action. He aims to force Iran back to the negotiating table to negotiate a better deal that would include regional issues, missiles, and extending and expanding the nuclear agreement. Biden wants to negotiate with Iran on the same issues, but is prepared to lift some sanctions to incentivize a return to the status quo ante, Iranian and US compliance with the nuclear deal. Whichever candidate wins, I think Iran is very unlikely to change course before its own June election, if even then. Neither Trump nor Biden rules out war with Iran, which would be catastrophic for the Gulf states. Doha has the most to lose. But war isn't an attractive proposition for Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Manama either. Israel and the Gulf states don't want Iran to get nuclear weapons and will cooperate to prevent it. But the Arabs will not want to risk joining Israel and the US in an overt conventional war with Iran, whose winner may be predictable, but whose consequences could be catastrophic for the Gulf. President Trump has been a welcome figure in the Arab Gulf, especially in Saudi Arabia. He shielded the kingdom and the crown prince from accountability for the murder of Jamal Khashoggi and continued the Obama administration's support for the Yemen war, despite growing bipartisan discomfort in the US. Because of his human rights commitments, Biden will be less favored in the Gulf. He will not be sword dancing in Riyadh or cheering the war in Yemen. But the differences should not obscure the similarities. The two candidates share the desire to reduce US commitments in the Gulf and the interest in preventing Iran from getting nuclear weapons. Several of their predecessors also had these goals and failed to achieve them. The reason, I'm afraid, is all too clear. The Americans have relied too heavily on coercion, too little on diplomacy. The United States has enormous destructive military, political, and economic power. But that alone cannot build what's needed: a regional security network that will reduce threat perceptions in all the Gulf states, Iran included, decrease incentives to develop nuclear weapons, and prevent encroachments by rival powers. This framework will require a stronger diplomatic nexus of mutual understanding, restraint, and respect. Continued low intensity and gray zone conflict or real war will make that much more difficult to achieve. The Gulf is not a military challenge, but rather a diplomatic one. Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Serwer, for a very intricately and yet immaculately structured talk that managed to stay within the time zones as well. So you get props both from my academic side and my disciplinarian side. Obviously, we have much to learn from you. The questions are already coming in. I will compile them all and ask them when the speakers have spoken. So please feel free to use the question function, and we'll do our best on that. Our next speaker, Cinzia Bianco, works at the European Council of Foreign Relations in Berlin. She is a frequent collaborator of both of the Gulf International Forum of Dr. Thafer and myself, and writes frequently in media outlets around the world. She is a graduate of she has her PhD from the University of Exeter, but most importantly, she has the master's degree in war studies from King's College London, which is sort of a hallmark of excellence in the academic world. The fact that I also have the same degree is just a coincidence. So you have 5 minutes, Dr. Bianco.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, David. And thank you very much to the Gulf International Forum for this very kind invitation and sharing the panel with such distinguished speakers. I think I will try to make the most of my time by focusing on highlighting rather trends that I think we saw starting in 2020 and we will see playing out in 2021 and onwards. So obviously, one of the buzzwords of 2020, I think, and the near future will be retrenchment. And it's not only about the retrenchment of the United States from the region, because there is a lot of controversies about to what extent the US is retrenching. Of course, the military footprint is and the security footprint is still as vivid as always. There is perhaps, we heard from Professor Serwer, a retrenchment in terms of the geopolitical involvement of the US and the diplomacy, and the diplomatic involvement of the US from the geopolitical rivalries in the Gulf. But I think that the questions that we get also more frequently as of late is, will the COVID-19 pandemic accelerate the retrenchment of either global powers and regional powers from the Gulf? I mean, of course, many of these actors have been hit by the pandemic, and this pandemic has hit their resources and their capacity for foreign and security policies as well. Many of these global governments are now looking inward to try and survive and fight this crisis and emerge on the other side relatively strong still. So there is definitely this question to be addressed. And I think that there are already initial indications that some of these strategies that even global players had been pushing for may be tweaked in the future. Let's think about China's Belt and Road Initiative, its flagship initiative, an extremely costly endeavor on all different fronts, not only financially, but also diplomatically, politically, requiring a lot of attention. What will happen to that? Will it be downsized? What will be the impact of the Belt and Road Initiative in the Gulf specifically, given that the inner side of the Gulf, let's think of Kuwait, Qatar, those places that are farther off from the Strait of Hormuz, were never central to the strategy. And what about the Gulf countries per se? We know that Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar to a lesser extent, they have been hyperactive on the regional scene. They have been investing a lot of resources, again, on different kinds to push for their interests. They themselves, and of course Saudi Arabia stands out in this regard, they have been hit by the pandemic and they have the need to focus inward and to really prioritize and drive towards optimization of their resources. I think that we also have initial indications here. We can already assess that the smaller countries such as the UAE or Qatar have been to a certain extent less impacted by the pandemic, and on the contrary have been able to provide assistance, support to other countries in the region. Let's think, for instance, of the UAE and how they have sometimes even used the COVID-19 diplomacy as an umbrella to engage even with very controversial actors, including Bashar al-Assad in Syria or the Iranian government. Qatar has also been in a position to provide some much needed assistance to Lebanon, for instance, on both medical, but also by trying to shore up the troubled financial situation. And then let's sort of contrast that with what we have seen from Saudi Arabia, which instead is really giving signals of the need to focus on Saudi affairs, on the Saudi economies, and on the monumental challenges that the COVID-19 pandemic has accelerated to the kingdom, with the partial exception of Riyadh really trying to get out of the war in Yemen and spectacularly failing at diplomacy as they have, unfortunately, at the military operations. These, I think, are indications of what is to come. We will see, I think, not a retrenchment from the Gulf monarchies, because especially where their key security interests are at stake, we will see, though, an optimization, and some key priorities will emerge even more clearly in the upcoming future. The fact that the UAE, for instance, has been increasingly focused on confronting the perceived challenges from Turkey rather than the challenges coming from Iran, because they perceive Iran as significantly weakened by the pandemic, is, I think, an interesting signal that really shows how real core priorities will come to light when there is the need to focus and prioritize. And then that leads me to my sort of second large trend, which is the differentiation between the Iranian threat and the Turkish threat, and how these are perceived very differently across the Gulf. And both fault lines coexisted between 2011 and 2020, so up until today, because when the Arab Spring came to the region and there was a perceived vacuum of power, both Iran and Turkey and the front that they represent were seen as best placed to take advantage of this vacuum to extend their influence. And this was a pretty common assessment, but at the same time, the priority that was assigned to the different threats and the different actors was very different across the Gulf. Even within the, for instance, the Saudi Emirati axis, which has been acting jointly on all different regional fronts. And I think those differences are really coming out as the Turkish threat becomes, in the local perception, more vivid than the Iranian threat, for instance, in Abu Dhabi, very clearly, but not necessarily in Saudi Arabia. And when we look, for instance, at the Eastern Mediterranean, where these fault lines are, the fault line with Turkey are really playing out, the difference is starking and clear. And the intensity with which the UAE is pursuing this confrontation is really an indication that this will continue in the near future. Before closing, one sort of final black swan that is regarded, I think, as the most dangerous and risky in several Gulf capitals, which is what will happen if suddenly the Turkish front and the Iranian front were to cooperate and join forces. This is, I think, a question that is being asked very intensely across the Gulf region, and is perceived as potentially the most dangerous development, furthering definitely fragmentation, but potentially also leading to tensions really getting out of hand. And if global powers will be retrenched, will be inward looking, will be hesitant to sort of step into a role of stability and security guarantor, could escalate kinetically as well. I will then pass back the floor, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Cinzia. And it's kind of ironic, as I was timing you, I remember you moderated a panel that I was on in Rome, and I blew through all the time hacks without noticing them. And I believe you actually used a fire extinguisher to get me to stop speaking. So I'm glad that you showed me more courtesy than I showed you. Our third speaker of the day is Dr. Shafeeq Ghabra. He's a professor of political science at Kuwait University. Has a graduate of 3 great American universities, a bachelor at Georgetown, master's from Purdue, one of America's finest engineering schools, and doctorate from the University of Texas, Austin. With that, Dr. Ghabra, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for the Gulf International Forum, and appreciate your introduction as well, Professor David. Now, to get to the topic, maybe with a view from a Gulf perspective, I do see all of this strategic situation that we have today starts with the Arab Spring. It starts with the conclusions Arab elites made of the Arab Spring. Some elites decided that maybe they need to be a little bit more flexible, a little bit more open, but the overall trend in the region then that really evolved and matured is you need to be more closed, less democratic, more authoritarian, more controlling, open more prisons, jails, torture, human rights violations, and that has occupied the entire story or part of the entire story of the Arab world since 2011 with the counter to 11, as we have seen it happen in Egypt and in other places. At the same time, that didn't end it here. There has been, and I mean, Trump comes, and with President Trump, you get this right-wing, narrow-minded mentality gained momentum. So we've seen, look at how the conclusions came, that you have a conclusion in the UAE, you have a conclusion to a large extent in Saudi Arabia as well, and it's in Egypt. It started in Egypt, in fact, to obliterate, not only to talk to or to shrink or to make them smaller, the Muslim Brothers, but also of all human rights activists. And therefore, the space has closed in the Arab world. Does this explode at some point? I believe so. I believe it's very hard to maintain that status quo. So can we draw an analysis that we are stable? Definitely not. If you've talked to me 20 years ago, 30 years ago, that's different. Today, we're not in a stability mood. We're in an instability mood. So you have this confrontation with popular movements, no matter how much they have in the street and whether they want to change or not, or they're fragmented, but they represent something and they're part of the. Now, when we talk about the Gulf, you don't have this all over the Gulf. You look at Kuwait, the Muslim Brothers are in the parliament. You look at Kuwait, also the Muslim Brothers will be in the coming elections in December. Many human rights activists do work in the region, but there are places where this has become total silence, and that's problematic. Now, on the other hand, we've seen the Yemen war. You see, this took the Arab world and took the Gulf. So it took Saudi Arabia in particular, first to quell, to destroy, to stop the Arab Bahraini rebellion that took place in Bahrain in 2011. And there were different opinions. If Kuwait wasn't for that military intervention, it wanted patience and negotiations. Unfortunately, this is what happened. Then you have the Yemen war. Then you have Libya and Haftar. Then you have all that support to President Sisi, regardless of what he does in his context, in his society, and who dies in jail and prison, and who's taken, etc. So you have all of these aspects. And then you had trying to intervene in Tunisia, then in Sudan, then it's also carries a lot of financial burdens to the UAE and to Saudi Arabia in particular. So that has also climaxed in a certain way with the Qatar siege, which was not understandable in any context. Qatar had an independent policy, so did Kuwait, but Qatar had maybe had a project, had ideas, had alliances in the region. They were normal to have, and yet there was that siege, that situation to crush it. Luckily, Kuwait was able to stay neutral. Oman was able to stay neutral. Luckily, there were attempts to minimize a potential for a military confrontation. Now, to come and add to all of that, your enemy is Iran and Turkey, then you're really getting into very hot waters down the line. And you cannot be against the Shia power and the Sunni power at the same time. It cannot happen. And if it happens, you're definitely miscalculating your these. And then you're into a much bigger project than your capabilities. So where do you end up? The Abraham deal. Israel, a military power, and a military power, one of the top in the world in arms shipments and deals and security. It persecutes the Palestinian people. It's evading any real justice and any deal that can lead to justice within any context that we can. It's building an apartheid, and that apartheid is clear today, and it will be more clear in the future. So where do we end? With all of this panorama, I think that adds militarism with Iran and with Turkey. And definitely Iran and Turkey at some point will come together. I see that happening already at some level in certain issues, despite their differences. So we are in a context that we can wake up one day and see a different event like the Qatar one, or see a different event like the Riz event. We can see a counter event like another Riz. I mean, there's no clarity on all of this. So today there is a military base in Qatar, which is Turkish. There is cooperation between Kuwait and Turkey, but not a military base. But also there is cooperation with the US, a US that is taking its way a little bit slowly, but maybe surely, to withdraw slowly from the region. And so that is adding, ultimately, the regional powers will dominate. We either have an Arab project, or there's today a Turkish project, there is an Iranian project, it's a weaker project, but it is a militaristic one. The Turkish project has ideas. Many of the Arabs who had to leave their Arab societies and Arab states in Egypt and across the Gulf, across so many, you cannot count the amount of Arabs who are today in Turkey, who are having dialogue with each other, who are thinking about tomorrow and after tomorrow. So there is an Arab question today. And the Arab question is what to do with all of this panorama, not only in the Gulf, because you have now Gulf individuals who are thinking beyond the Gulf. Because even if you do whatever you do and you have all these differences and you have Turkey on one side, you have Iran, you have Iraq, you have all this. So there is a talk about but this is still incipient. This is still in the underground. This is still writings and debates and discussion by young people who participated in the Arab Spring of 2011, who have matured and learned from their mistakes in 2011. So that's something to watch and to look at. I think we're in unstable waters, but yet we have to do our best to stabilize as much as possible while understanding the type of instability that now has infected the entire region and has infected the Gulf region. Thank you.
Well, wise counsel, Dr. Shafeeq. You can't change the ocean, but you can strive to understand it and sail your ship the best way possible. Okay, thank you to all the panelists for being not just informative, but also concise. And now we're going to go to the questions. I urge you to submit them to the question thing. I will aggregate them and farm them out. So the first one is on Saudi Arabia. It's a two-part question. I'm going to give it to you, Dr. Shafeeq. Is the crisis in Yemen a Gulf security issue per se? And the second part of the question is it a just war? I'm going to answer that.
Okay. Well, but on the record, it is not a just war. I think it was a war of option. Saudi Arabia could have chosen other methods. It had a lot of influence in Yemen historically. It is unfortunate that it could not use its influence to bring people to the table. So it is not an issue of security. The whole idea of the Yemen war, if you all recall, was a 2-week war. Like World War I. I mean, it was 2 weeks. Like even World War II. I mean, I don't know, it was 1 month or 2 months, or like a lot of wars, like the Iran-Iraq war. It was supposed to be a 1 month war. I mean, and so we have a 2-week war. And I remember going on the record then and saying that this is going to last for years and years and years. And Yemen is not going to be an easy to penetrate. It's going to divide, it's going to destroy, it's going to be a historical long-term problem even beyond that war, but the war will go on for years. So it was a war of choice, and I think it came from a minister of defense who wanted to make sure the power is consolidated and that you pick up a quick war and you win, and therefore you have credentials now. Unfortunately, it was a huge miscalculation.
Okay. So the question is that I asked you is the crisis a Gulf security issue, but you said it was a war of choice. Is there any other thoughts on that? Is the crisis in Yemen, the war in Yemen, a Gulf security issue per se, or is it sort of regionalized, peripheral?
Yes, it cannot be a Gulf security issue because from the beginning, there were different perspectives in the Gulf when the Yemen war started. So I would say Kuwait was hesitant. I mean, at least in Kuwait, we've gone through a war, and we've gone through 1990 and 91 and the liberation, and we've gone through the whole complexity with Iraq. We just understand how complex.
Thank you.
So yes, so it wasn't a Gulf security. The perspectives between Qatar, Kuwait, Oman, and others were, and Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. Most hawkish on the Yemen war was UAE and Saudi Arabia, and I think they both felt they can get the cake, most of it, and the others participated, didn't say no, part of the GCC, but yet they played a more junior role, and yet things did not evolve in any good direction in this war.
Any other comments from Dr. Serwa, Dr. Bianco on the possible Gulf security issue, or can we move on? Okay, the questioner asked if Saudi conduct constitutes war crimes. So I'm just going to abuse my prerogative because I'm a war college professor and I actually teach this at Saudi War College. So what is a war crime is not incompetence, inefficiency, does not in itself constitute a war crime. So it actually draws from the theology of St. Thomas Aquinas, which is right there on my bookshelf. And you have two criteria, whether just ad bello, whether the reasons for war are just, and then just in bello, whether you are actually pursuing the war in a just manner. When you look at, in a legalistic sense, just ad bello, the fact that the then and now internationally recognized government invited the Saudis would seem to indicate that you don't have a war crime. Whether it's smart or not is a separate question. And it's worth noting out that the Russians and the Iranians in Syria point out that we've been invited by the Syrians, whereas you Americans have not. The second question, which is what most people focus on, is whether the conduct of the war itself is just, whether bombing is being conducted in a discriminate, proportionate manner. And usually that's what most people are talking about. And people who think Saudis committed war crimes say that it is not. And people who are more inclined to cut sides of break say it is. So if you're interested in that and the efficacy, just tweet and I'll send you a C-SPAN clip of me right the day the bombing started saying the points that Dr. Shafeeq just made, which is that this war is not likely to go the good way. And if it's not solved in 2 weeks, it's not going to be solved for a very long time. All right, next question. I'm going to throw this to Dr. Bianco. Is Turkey more of a threat for Iran, more of a threat than Iran for the Gulf states? The rising perception of Turkey as a threat state. Your thoughts?
I mean, this is, I think, a very interesting question because the perspective on this really changes across the Gulf. Yes, there is a very tight relationship between the UAE and Saudi Arabia, and I have consistently advocated in favor of this axis being very hard to break. I know that other colleagues have different opinions, but I have said that, for instance, the Yemen war, although the two powers did have different objectives and different levels of commitment, we wouldn't break the UAE-Saudi alliance. And I will reiterate saying that this alliance will not be broken by a different perception that they have about Turkey and Iran. However, there are significant differences. For Saudi Arabia, Iran remains the priority threat. For the UAE, at the moment, the priority threat is Turkey. The reason for that, and I have sort of elaborated on this in several papers in the recent past, is that, in my opinion, for Saudi Arabia, Iran is not exclusively an external threat. It is at the same time an external and an internal threat. And this overlap between the external and internal dimension makes it a very more pungent and more dangerous actor. For the UAE, I would argue that both threats, both the Iranian and the Turkish threat, are regarded as external. They threaten the UAE's capacity to, first and foremost, the UAE's capacity and ability to extend its own regional influence and its own network. And the internal dimension, the domestic dimension, in other words, Emirati Shia or Emirati sympathizers with the Muslim Brotherhood and political Islam, is perceived as being much smaller than it is across the border in Saudi Arabia. David, I think
Unmute. There we go. Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm doing this on an iPad, so when a question comes in, it blocks my ability to unmute. Dr. Serwa, I got a low-hanging fastball right over the plate for you, since you're an expert on the uses of power and all that. Rachel Ziemba, who will be moderating tomorrow's panel, and I urge you all to subscribe to that, asks if the U.S. is too much dependent on coercion, and if we would be better served by a more constructive engagement, particularly in this current cash-strapped environment.
The short answer is yes. We've overemphasized coercion against particular countries. I think there are serious security issues among the Gulf countries, and let me include in the Gulf countries Turkey, Iran, plus the Arab Gulf. It seems to me that they lack the kind of mutual understanding, the kind of mutual restraint that exists in many other parts of the world. It's not uncommon to have threat perceptions. What's uncommon in the Middle East is that there's almost no infrastructure of organizations, of norms, of practices that constrains how you react to threat perceptions. So, you know, it's a situation that's, what should I say? It's law of the jungle, more or less, in the Middle East, and in particular in the Gulf. And so everybody's constantly testing each other because they have no, there's very little perception of you know, we've lived with this for a long time. We know what the reaction will be. We don't want to test anybody else. And I think it's in part, as Professor Shafeeq points out, it's in part the Arab Spring that unleashed some of these forces. Everything became possible with the Arab Spring. I do think the Emiratis, for example, are excessively frightened of the Muslim Brotherhood. I've had many discussions with them in which they expressed a lot of concern about it. Seems to me greatly exaggerated, but it's in part because of what happened in Egypt. And they worked very hard to reverse what happened in Egypt. So you don't have, people talk to each other in the Gulf, they talk to each other in the Middle East, but you don't have the same kind of nexus of relationships and norms and organizational capacities that you have in most of the rest of the world. And I think the United States is going to find it very difficult to get out of the Middle East and out of the Gulf until some kind of nexus of mutual security relationships is established.
Yeah, I think you're right. The lack of architecture is a real challenge, And even at the height of the Cold War, we had an architecture to engage the Soviet Union, and it's just lacking now. I
was trying to avoid the word architecture because some people think that it implies something very structured. That's why I talk about a nexus of relationships, because I don't actually think it's the architecture that matters. It's the nexus of relationships and the capacity to anticipate each other's moves that comes from the constant flow of information about what other people think.
Okay, fair enough. But you haven't seen the clowns who renovated my kitchen. All right, Dr. Shafeeq, I'm combining two questions for you. They're basically the same. One's from an anonymous questioner, and the other is from M. Lambles. What are the implications of the passing of the Emir of Kuwait and the Sultan of Oman? And the anonymous caller goes a little further and says, will this affect the seemingly not pivot, but the engagement with Ankara and with Tehran?
That's the question. But I had a small comment
Sure.
on the issue of Iran briefly, is that though there are many differences with Iran, there is many in the Gulf who believe that the Gulf should not be a confrontation area with Iran, should carry our differences in other areas of the world, in the Arab world, maybe in Syria, but we do not need to militarize the Gulf region. And it's in this context that the Kuwait policy was internally, we have a sizable Shia population. They are Kuwaitis, and they are represented in parliament equal to their size. And they have their organizations of civil society, and they have different political lines and views. Now, if you are very extreme, that's militaristic, goes in a certain direction, brings weapons, that's another story that applies to Qaeda as well and ISIS. So we have, on the Sunni level, the Muslim brothers, the Salafis, and then the seculars and others and human rights. And so you're able to absorb by opening the system rather than closing the system. And that's one way of dealing with it, instead of alienating the Shias and pushing them towards Iran, as has happened in the past. And so there is a history here that we need to analyze. But on the other side, the external threat is that's the call of Kuwait. And the Emir of Kuwait, the deceased Emir of Kuwait, always called for dialogue with Iran. We need to talk to the Iranians. We need to rationalize that conflict, bring it to some level of what happens and what doesn't happen. And the Iranians do understand pragmatism. They already did the nuclear deal. They already talked to others in the region. We have a decent relation with them in Kuwait. So does the Qataris, and they have even a business relation. So does the Emiratis on a certain level. They have business relations on the table, under the table. That's beyond the point. So does the Omanis. So there is no need to exaggerate that and bring it to a situation where, we have to depend on Israel, we militarize more, we alienate the Iranians. It becomes a much more rebellious state, rather than we absorb that state that has always feared from the existence of military bases in the region that are American, that we need to always calm them, that these are not going to be used against you, rather than remind them every day that you'll be the first to hit. There has to be a different approach. So this is on the Iran external, internal issue. On the Emir of Kuwait, I see stability. I see a decent transition, and I see strong leadership, because we have the Emir who came to power. He's a very compassionate person. And there is a lot of talk about even some exiles from Kuwait over differences on issues of protests and movements in 2011, 2012. They should be coming back. There is talk about changing the election law at some point. There are all kinds of internal issues to open up more rather than to close the system more. And we have a crown prince who's strong, and it's important for the regional balance, who is an old political operative, but he's a security man at the same time from the National Guard of Kuwait. He was the deputy of the National Guard. But at the same time, we have a parliament, we have elections, we have civil society, we have levels of expression that doesn't exist elsewhere. But at the same time, we're not happy with these levels of expression, and we would want to see more of them. And therefore, people are talking in the parliament, outside the parliament, of a better law for public talk and expression and open space and political groups, etc., etc. So I see the stability in terms of the relation with Qatar, the neutrality, and the relation with Saudi Arabia and Emirates continues to be a good relation without being weak or without siding with their version, neither siding with the Qatari version, neither with the Omani, but I could see relations evolve with Qatar at some level, and with it has already happened, and with the Omanis at another, but yet maintaining as good as possible a relation with Saudi Arabia and the Emirates without being totally absorbed by their outlook to the world and to the region and to America. We have an election coming soon that's going to have an impact on us as well, and on these different views and trends that exist today in the Arab world. Kuwait's position to keep neutrality with Iran, to keep a good relation with Turkey. We don't see Turks as a danger or as a threat. On the contrary, the Turks are popular in the Arab world. And there is one reason they are popular in the Arab world, that they have championed the Palestine question, whether rightly or wrongly, whether you like it or you don't. They have been able to talk genuinely about it, despite their strong relations with the Israelis, but they're not as strong as they exist that they used to be before the Erdogan era. So Erdogan is a popular figure at a certain level in certain corners, in large corners. The more you are disadvantaged, and the more you are persecuted, and the more you are in jail, and the more you are, etc., then Erdogan. And if you are a Shiite, then Iran. And if you are see, people will seek that the way Americans thought it one day. I mean, the French were their ideal at a certain time when they supported their movement. So we're ahead of us is a lot, but I see Kuwait stable by building its unity and by trying to maintain a similar policy, but maybe more institutional, that the parliament plays a role, that the government plays a role, that the prime minister, but in the case of the former emir, it was the former emir. He played all of these roles. I think now we're going to see a setup by which there is a division of labor between different representatives of the government of Kuwait and the emirate, the state of Kuwait, and as well the parliament of Kuwait and the civil society.
Okay, thank you for that, Professor. That's good. And you know, you're right. I've actually worked with Shia general officers in the Kuwaiti armed forces, which is, you know, to find that is quite remarkable. Dr. Bianco, David Speedle asks, does the preoccupation with Iran blind us? I think when he says us, he means the United States, but you can expand it to Europe since that is where you live.
Yeah. Yes, and if you will allow me, I will also touch a little bit on a following question, which talks about possibilities for regional de-escalation in the event of a Biden presidency. And I will sort of quickly combine them because from a European perspective, that is what European governments are thinking about. So the dominant view in Europe is that Iran is a regional player and should be treated as any other regional player, in a sense, sort of give Iran the right to play some role, include Iran into a regional architecture, de-escalate tension, try to channel Iranian regional behavior, which is destabilizing and is recognized as destabilizing in Europe as well. And you would know that, for instance, a couple of European countries have already declared Hezbollah to Kur as a terrorist organization. There are a lot of questions and there is a lot of criticism and strong words against some of Iran's regional activities. But at the same time, the perspective in Europe is that a critical engagement is the most successful way to channel Iranian behavior towards a more constructive horizon. And this is what European governments are thinking about, especially in a scenario of a Biden presidency, given that Joe Biden has publicly said that he would return to the JCPOA, which in Europe's view is a key instrument into the path, the process towards sort of softening the edges of Iranian presence in the region. We at the European Council on Foreign Relations are specifically thinking about policy ideas in a publication that we will release in November, so next month. And what we're working on is the idea of a regional dialogue that goes hand in hand with re-entering the JCPOA and walking towards a JCPOA plus. That is an option that is being sort of reluctantly, but in some ways also being considered in the UAE and even in Saudi Arabia. And we had Faisal bin Farhan, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, at the press conference after the first US-Saudi strategic dialogue, publicly saying that the end goal would be a JCPOA +++ for Saudi Arabia, therefore giving a slight opening towards a process that would link together the two discussions on the nuclear file and the regional dialogue, but we also have to find a way that the two don't block each other. So there's going to be a lot of diplomatic heavyweight to do, a lot of flexible models to consider, and I think it's quite clear that the only way that this is going to succeed is for the United States and Europeans to work together, because it's really a massive enterprise.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Serwer, another fungo for you. Besides sanctions, how can the U.S. stop Iranian supportive militias in places like Yemen, Lebanon, and Iraq?
Pardon me.
That's all right. That's all right. I'll restate the question. I think this is pretty much in keeping with your research and writing. Besides sanctions, how can the U.S. stop Iran supporting militias in places like Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria?
I think it's going to be very difficult. Iranian support for these militias has been terrifically successful at low cost to Tehran. And if you talk to Iranians, establishment Iranians about it, they'll tell you, look, we felt threatened and we need to defend ourselves beyond our borders, just the way you say you have to defend yourself beyond your borders. You don't want to fight at home, you want to fight abroad. And that's what they've done at very low cost. So I think, you have to reduce Iran's threat perception in order to get it to move on these other issues. President Obama did that at the General Assembly. I won't remember the year, but he essentially said, not in quite so many words, he essentially said, we're not seeking regime change in Iran. We'll talk to the current Iranian regime and we'll leave it alone. And that was an important precondition for the negotiations on the Iranian nuclear file. Why didn't the Americans go for more agreements than only on the nuclear file? The answer is in part they didn't want to pay the price. And the price was clearly going to be recognition. We were going to have to recognize and establish diplomatic relations with Iran. And that looms in the future. And I think it has to be there as a carrot in addition to the sticks, not in replacement of the sticks, but in addition to the sticks, we have to have a carrot, and that carrot, I think the most meaningful one for Iran, besides relief from the sanctions, is diplomatic recognition. Now that's a hard pill for the Americans to swallow. There's no question about it. Iran, the Islamic Republic, is an abusive regime, abusive to its own people and abusive to the region as well. But you do it if you get a good deal on their regional behavior. And I think we have to recognize up front that that's what's at stake, is giving up the American ambition for regime change, which certainly existed in the Bush administration, was suspended in the Obama administration, and now exists in some rhetorical form, at least, if not on the ground inside Iran, in the Trump administration. I actually do believe it exists on the ground inside Iran as well. So I think we have to be honest with ourselves that if we want Iran behaving better, we're going to have to offer them, and in areas other than the nuclear file, on missiles, on regional behavior, there has to be something on offer that's bigger than what was on offer during the JCPOA negotiations.
That's a good point. That plays into the next question, which Dr. Bianco has already taken a slight swing at. Jamie Playdell asks, what are the prospects for a Biden de-escalation and the establishment of JCPOA plus? I'll weigh in just a little bit on this from some of my perspective, working law enforcement issues in the Clinton administration, by analogy with North Korea, where one of our big concerns we had with North Korea was production of methamphetamine on an industrial scale and counterfeiting U.S. currency. And in order to get a deal on the nuclear file with North Korea, we basically had to stop naming North Korea as a major drug trafficking country, and we eliminated some sanctions on counterfeiting as well. So there were extraneous issues brought in. I'm not sure if we can do this with Iraq. I mean, from an Iranian perspective, I think the sanctions on missiles, support of militias, human rights. I think they, to go back to the JCPOA, Iran would say, well, we didn't have those sanctions. Those need to be lifted too. That'll be very tough for Joe Biden to do. And it's also worth noting that while the Republicans were all against the JCPOA, so was Chuck Schumer, the leader of the Democratic Party in the Senate. So was Robert Menendez, the leader of the Democratic Foreign Affairs Committee in the Senate. So it's not necessarily going to be an easy thing. And, the Iranians may just ask for more. They may ask for compensation from damage that in their eyes was illegally foisted upon them when the United States illegally left us. Anybody else want to take a whack at that? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on. Next question is from Ambassador Pat Theros, who, chairman of the board of the GIF, asks about the possibility of Turkey and Iran collaborating. And I'll throw that out to the group. Turkey and Iran elaborating. Collaborating, rather. So.
You want to come to me, if you allow me?
Sure, Shafeeq, yeah, it's your turn. Yeah.
Actually answer that.
Great.
That I have seen Iran and Turkey on a colluding course, particularly when the Arab Spring began and when the Assad repressive regime massacred the Syrian people, and months into as the Syrians involved the Iranians and later the Russians, but the Iranians, I saw Turkey and Iran on a colluding course, but I do see them now on a less colluding course. I see them cooperating more. I see them seeing similar threats. An accord like the Abraham's Accord, UAE, Saudi Arabia, heightens that possibility for cooperation because it brings espionage, it brings infiltration, it brings so many things that may be problematic for the Turks. The Turks continue to send a messages to the region regarding change. They continue to be anti-Sisi totally, and with changes in the way President Sisi has behaved regarding his people, but also regarding prisoners. I mean, and so many issues. It doesn't mean Turkey doesn't have human rights issues. There has been critique of Turkey's behavior in so many ways, but the Turks have political parties, have a parliament, you have opposition. The friends of President Erdogan, his colleagues who were with him all along are splitting and forming other parties and could be running for election. And it's not a 99.9. It's a much better system relative to it's a better model relative to what exists in the Arab world today, where you don't have any of that. And if you do have any of that, it is totally corrupted and undermined, and there is no due process, and there is no way to express the whole media is totally controlled. So when it's a different one. Even the Iranians, despite their repressive regime, have institutions, and they have a diversity of institutions they can build on. Some of our countries don't even have the minimum standard of what institutions do. That's why they're very fragile, and that's why they need external help, and that's why they go to the Abraham's deal, and that's why they end up doing things that will anger the population in the region more. This is not true that the people of the region are happy with it. They will be happy with it in case the Israelis dismantle their apartheid, in case they stopped their wall, in case they opened up the prisons, they made changes in human rights, they made changes on quality of life, they recognized political rights for the Palestinians. People will not be happy with something that totally ignores your rights and totally insults you, and at the same time, Jerusalem. I mean, the Arabs will not forget Jerusalem. I mean, the Israelis can think whatever they want. This was occupied in 1967. There was a deal that it comes back to the Arab world, that it could be a divided or a united under two sovereignties. None of that would be accepted. It will only cause issues down the line and bring so many agitation. So I do see the Iranians and the Turks at some point collaborating, and I agree with what also Dr. Dania, I also agree with Dr. Bianco, what she said about the situation for the nuclear deal and others. But I agree with Dr. Daniel, you cannot easily end the militias for one simple reason. What the Iranians did is they built militias that are indigenously part of the indigenous socio-economic political structure. And that's not easy to I mean, Hezbollah is part of the Lebanese people. You disagree, you agree, maybe you need to minimize their role in Lebanese politics, in other politics. You disagree with them totally on Syria. I do as well. But at the same time, you cannot come and say, I'm dismantling you and then I'm bringing you to where you were 30 years ago. And then the Israelis will wage something and then there'll be a right-wing government. I mean, the Hezbollah will not go, but if it can be weaker and it can be more moderate, again, with dialogue, with agreements, with understanding. But to say regime change and to say dismantle Hezbollah and to say dismantle Muslim Brothers and dismantle I don't know what and dismantle every popular movement in the region and every indigenous movement, that's a framework for civil wars. And that cannot happen.
Yeah.
David, I wonder if I
yes, sir.
say a word about Iran and Turkey.
Please.
Professor Shafeeq has emphasized their commonality on the question of Palestine. But when I look around the region at the really pressing issues for Turkey in particular, there are two that put it at odds with Iran. And one of those is Syria, obviously, where they find themselves on opposite sides. And the other is, let's call it Azerbaijan, Armenia, where, Iran, for its own reasons, has been supportive more of Armenia than of Azerbaijan, despite the fact that there are more Azeris in Iran than in Azerbaijan.
Well, that may be the explanation.
That may be the explanation, but the point is that the urgent sometimes chases out the overwhelmingly important, and the war in Syria, the war in Armenia, Azerbaijan, these are urgent issues for Turkey at the moment, and I think they would make it quite difficult for a broader collusion between Iran and Turkey.
Let me pile on with a question I'd been planning to give you the next question from Ahmed about the murder of Jamal Khashoggi. Do you think that that has contributed to personal hostility between Mohammed bin Salman and Erdogan? Do you think that's personalized, or is that still an issue of state?
Well, it's certainly an issue of state. I'd be surprised if it weren't also personalized. I mean, Erdogan has been aiming for Mohammed bin Salman, and I can't imagine that the feelings are any kinder on the other side of the equation. I mean, let's face it, this was an atrocious thing to do. It deserves all the condemnation that it's gotten. And we should remember what was Jamal's demand? What was he looking for? He was looking for freedom of expression.
Yeah.
And is that really too much to ask from somebody who advertises himself as a reformer in Saudi Arabia? I don't really think so. This is personal, it's the state, and it's become a real problem, and I suspect if Biden wins, will be a real problem between the United States and Saudi Arabia.
I agree with you. Okay, we're going to transition now into the lightning round. And in the lightning round, I'm going to ask you a big question, and you've got 30 seconds to answer. If you say the lucky word, a duck drops down from the ceiling and gives you $50. So everybody's going to be asked the same question. It comes from M. Lambers, his second bite at the apple. Does the GCC still matter? And we'll start with you, Dr. Bianco.
Yes, I think it still matters, because when the parties will be ready to come to a resolution of the GCC crisis, they will have an architecture, a structure that will fast track this resolution in terms of piercing together some institutional cooperation, reviving, dusting off some policies that made the GCC relevant. So I think it matters because it will be useful when the parties will be politically ready to solve the crisis. I don't think it will be a means to solve the crisis.
Dr. Shafeeq?
I agree with Dr. Bianca that it still matters, but it matters much less. It's divided now. And I think people are going in different lines. This may become a much bigger difference over time, and particularly with external parties getting involved, such as the Israelis, among others. On the other hand, the GCC has done what other Arab organizations have done. No institution building, no open system, there is no second opinion or third opinion or open opinion. They don't hear their consultative assembly. There is no GCC parliament. You don't have a parliament in your country, so how are you going to do a GCC? It stays like a club for a very small number of elites, but they have also their differences, big states, small states, different policies, different orientations, under the existing conditions, under the existing outlook, under the existing mentality that has caused so much issues and havoc. I don't see the GCC able to mend fences. It may be able on the surface to manage that. We've had that on the surface, despite so many differences. I think on the surface, it still matters, but it's not going to be easy. They haven't even agreed then on the central bank to be in Dubai, despite the closeness between Dubai and Saudi Arabia. There were so many issues that continue to divide the GCC. We are in a divided Arab world. We are in a divided GCC. We are in a state of wars, and we are in a state of transition, much more intensive than we've seen in the past. And there will be surprises down the line.
Okay, Dr. Bianco.
I think that
I'm sorry, I already asked you.
It was Professor Serwer's turn.
Yeah, it's Dr. Serwer's turn. I'm so sorry, I went the wrong way. Yeah, Dr. Serwer, sorry.
I don't know if the GCC still matters or will even matter in the future. I think when I talk to people in the Gulf about what really divides the GCC, it's not personalities. It's really the question of the role of political Islam in the Muslim world. And until there's some kind of closing of the gap on that issue, I think it's going to be very difficult to have a united GCC that would have its proper weight.
Okay, and I'm going to weigh in on the lightning round. I've always argued that the GCC is an organization that was created in times of crisis, and it seems to be at its best in times of crisis. So it doesn't live or die per se; it incubates. And when there's a crisis, then the butterfly emerges from the chrysalis. And then when there isn't, it goes back into the chrysalis. Our second question in the lightning round comes from Amr Abdullah. I'm rephasing this because I think this was meant to be a little bit more contentious, but he basically asked what would be views on the Muslim Brotherhood overthrowing a government and replacing it. So I'm going to phrase this as, first off, is it possible that the Muslim Brotherhood could take power in a GCC state? And then if so, what would the reactions be of say the regional powers and the international powers? And let's go in order again. Dr. Bianco, and you'll only get asked this once.
Yeah, okay, that's a good one. I don't think that there is any actual possibility that the Muslim Brotherhood will take power and overthrow a regime in the GCC in the near future. I think that there have been a lot of concerns. At some point in time between 1995 and 2005, there were two different episodes where even in Oman, the Sultan was strongly concerned that this could happen. So there's always this threat floating around. But at this point in time, after abundant repression that happened after the Arab Spring, I don't think that the Muslim Brotherhood or whatever local affiliate in any GCC country is strong enough to really pose an existential threat.
Okay, Dr. Shafeeq.
Be able to, your question, could the Muslim Brothers be able to take control of a GCC country? The answer on the immediate is no. They have never been aggressive. They've been always part of the Saudi context and the Saudi way of life as well. and they have never presented a threat. They were more extremist groups. So the only way I could see that if the Arab world explodes altogether, and you have like revolutions along the lines of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and that is a possibility to be analyzed. But this comes out of repression. This comes out of an attitude like the Shah of Iran that can bring people to rebel. But I don't see that happening at all in the United Arab Emirates or in Kuwait or in Bahrain. I mean, the small countries of the region have small populations, and the Muslim Brothers have been always part of the structure. The Muslim Brothers in Egypt took control, but they did it through election. It was a revolution that they joined after it started by days. They were not even part of instigating it. It came out of repression. So if you tell me repression can bring about whoever is ready in the street, yes, that can happen. So let's say in America, you have somebody in the president who decides not to leave power totally, and then the Democratic Party becomes like the Muslim Brothers, a danger, and Antifa becomes ISIS and Qaeda and I don't know what. And so you end up with a divided country by which one group has to obliterate the other groups, not an agreement on even sharing power. I think the future for the monarchies of our region is to go more for an open system. I think constitutional monarchies are possible models. They don't have to happen immediately, but there can be steps such as freedom of speech and a few others, and a parliament and some expression that has some powers and then more powers, rather than to stay stagnated and wait for the unthinkable to happen. And it won't be the Muslim Brothers. I think the Muslim Brothers today are in their weakest, but this doesn't mean there are no other social movements in the process and that the Muslim Brothers are part of it, but they're not the only one.
All right, lightning round. Dr. Serwer.
No, I don't think they're a serious threat any place but, ironically, Egypt, where the repression has created conditions that could cause them to do things that amount to a seizure of power. They've learned from what was done to them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good point. I should point out here, I went to the U.S. Army War College. I was a classmate of Brigadier General Abdel Fattah el-Sisi. And when this program is over, I will tweet out his thesis from the Army War College. My Twitter is @DB_DeRoche. It's a little @ DB DeRoche. My name's spelled here. And if you read that thesis, I don't think you could predict which way he would have broken on that issue. So it's worth reading. Okay. Well, I want to thank the panelists and I want to thank the questioners. We got to, I think there were 2 questions that we couldn't get to just because we had to work on all of this. Lazaro Albarasan, I'm sorry, we couldn't answer your question, but there's been a number of think tanks around town that have dealt with that question in the last week or so, to include one that I'm on that you can see the panel of it. So with that, I want to thank the Gulf International Forum for hosting this annual conference. I'm sorry we're doing it virtually, but these are the times in which we live. And I want to thank the panelists, the questioners, the moderators for your patience, for your indulgence. And I look forward to seeing everybody in person at a future Gulf International Forum event. Dr. Thafer, do you want to make any final remarks? Okay, well, thank you all. And with that, we will cease it and wish you the best. Have a good day, everybody.
Wish you the best.
Shukran jazeera.